it's Mo. Last month in March, I put out a video where I showed the first 3 Savidge prompts that I completed. If you go to that video down below, you can see what I read for January, February, and March's prompt. We are now in April, and April's prompt is to read a book that takes place in a city that you love. I hemmed and hawed over what my favorite city is, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to read one book for this prompt or multiple books and then do multiple months prompt in one vlog. The first thing that I had to decide was what my favorite city or what a favorite city was that I wanted to read from. Obviously, I lived for a long time and grew up in Brooklyn, so I love Brooklyn. I love London. I've been there. But lately I have been missing and longing for one of my all-time favorite cities, which is New Orleans in Louisiana in the USA. I visited New Orleans several times and I just love it there. There's something so magical. It's one of the most magical places that I've ever been, a place where you can stumble on people doing extraordinary things when you're not expecting it. New York and Brooklyn can be like that too, but it's an ever-moving, ever-changing city, whereas there's something stuck in time about New Orleans, and there's something timeless when you're there. There's a feeling that time is suspended in a lot of ways, and that you could move through the world of New Orleans and no time's passed, or maybe you've been there for many, many months and you don't realize it. So it's a city that I absolutely adore, and I looked around on my shelves. I found 3 books that I have that feature New Orleans. So my last video for Savidge Prompts, I read 3 books for 3 months, and this video I thought I would read 3 books for my April prompt. The first book that I have is The Axeman by Ray Celestine. This is a historical fiction set in New Orleans that was written in 2014, but takes place in 1918 and 1919 when the real-life Axeman murders were happening. The Axeman was a real serial killer who terrorized the city by brutally murdering families with an axe, and a little less than a year after he started murdering people, he sent a letter to the large local newspaper explaining that he was in league with the devil, that he was a demon himself, and that he planned on murdering many more people and the police would never catch him. One of the ways that the Axeman said that you could avoid his wrath was by playing jazz. He loved jazz, and he said that anyone who had a jazz band going in their house would be spared. Coined the term the Axeman's Jazz, and many books have been written about that story, either historical fictions, non-fictions, or contemporary books that riff on that. And I'll talk about one of those that I've read in the past in just a minute. But The Axeman by Ray Celestine is a pretty straightforward historical fiction following a newspaper man, a cop, a amateur sleuth, an ex-cop, as they all race time to try and discover who the Axeman is and stop his ghoulish reign. Another book that I want to read for this vlog is The Uptown House by Melissa Ginsberg. This also takes place in New Orleans, of course, all these books do, but this one is much, much different. It is actually slightly a historical fiction because there are elements in this book that happened in the 90s, and we're following a young girl whose mother can't take care of her, so she ships her to her grandmother's house in New Orleans, and it's about this girl's experience with her grandmother, how her grandmother lived a very bohemian lifestyle and indulged in the many bacchanal experiences of New Orleans. That's about all I know about this book. I first heard about this one from Mercedes, and I luckily found it a few days after hearing about it, but I haven't had a chance to read it. It's very short, so I think it'll be a good one to read in this vlog. Finally, one of my favorite cozy mystery series is the Skip Langdon series by Julie Smith, and all those books feature New Orleans, and I really love them. I've read 3 previous to this one, which is Jazz Funeral. And one of the books that I've read was called The Axeman's Jazz, and that features a killer who is emulating the Axeman murders, but set in the 90s. When we first meet Skip Langdon in the first book, she is a young detective and she wants to make homicide. She happens to stumble across a crime that has to do with the upper crust families in New Orleans, and since she is associated with those from her past, she is brought in to investigate and kind of parlays this into being a detective. I've read book 1, 2, and 4, and this is book 3, I think, or I've read 1, 2, and 3, and this is book 4. I can never remember the order. And they do kind of build on each other. Not only Skip's experience progression from low-level cop to detective, but also her relationships within the force, her relationships with her 2 best friends, one of which she lives in his guest house, and her various love interests all come into play throughout this book, and there is an overarching story within it. I also think the Skip Langdon books usually deal with slightly heavier topics than a lot of cozy mysteries, so there's definitely always more going on than just a typical cozy, which I really enjoy. They're also super fun and fluffy and super quick to read, which is why I think I can get through all these books in April. I did start with The Axeman, and I'm only about a quarter of the way through. This book is really long for me. It's over 420 pages, but so far I'm enjoying it. I think what I'm struggling with is that there's so many multiple perspectives. We have met Michael, the police officer. We have met Luca, who used to be a police officer with Michael but has been dishonored. We've met Ida, who is a Pinkerton, or a wannabe Pinkerton. We have met John Riley, who is a reporter. But we also get chapters that focus on their friends. Ida has a friend named Louis who helps her out, and we get chapters from him. Luca and Michael know other police officers, and we get chapters from them. So there's a lot of different perspectives. Although we're seeing it through an omnipotent view, not from a first-person view for each one, it is still a little bit confusing and overwhelming for someone who doesn't like multiple perspective narrations. So far, we have met all our characters, and the Axeman has been active for almost a year. He has sent a letter into the police, and in this book, which is obviously a fictional book, the actual Axeman letter was reprinted. So the letter within this book that the Axeman sends to the Times is the letter that appeared in the 1919 Times down in New Orleans. So that's kind of interesting. The city's whipped into a frenzy. It's terrified. We're also seeing how the city has changed and how much the city is segregated into different sections. And this was true of New Orleans history, that it was a huge epicenter for immigrants and different varieties of people, but they remained very much themselves, and at one time or another, absolutely every one of the groups was villainized or marginalized to more or less of an extent. So we're seeing that a lot, and one of the things that I'm struggling with in this book is that we're seeing that from the perspective of all these different people, and there obviously is a overarching theme of connection that I think the author is trying to make the point that all these people are actually connected. There should be no hierarchy, that there shouldn't be any racism, and that the segregation is more harmful than it is good. So I think it's trying to send a good message, but it's definitely doing it using racial slurs and ableism language and, you name it, inappropriate things that we wouldn't want today. And so it toes the line between the characters acting that way, but you knowing that that's just the characters, and it being inappropriate for the book. I think one of the reasons that I'm struggling so hard with that is because this was written by a white British man, and so this man, isn't any of the immigrants that he's talking about, so it's hard to stomach when he's using racial slurs or when he's writing from a Black perspective. If you put that kind of stuff aside, if you can put that stuff aside, I've been enjoying it so far. I just started reading it the other day, and it's going very quickly. It's long, and the type is very small, and the margins are small, but there's a lot of blank spaces, and the chapters are really short, which I do find, especially in long books, the chapters being short really helps move it along. So I will get back to you when I read some more of the Axeman's Jazz, and then we'll move on to the other New Orleans books. Let me know if you've read any book featuring New Orleans and what it is, because I would love to read every book featuring New Orleans if I could. And let me know if you've ever visited New Orleans and what you thought of it, and I'll catch up with you when I read some more. finished The Axeman. I did not update you during this whole over 400 page book because I couldn't decide how I felt about it. There were some aspects of this that I really did like, and there were some aspects that I didn't. It follows many people in search of the Axeman murderer. So all these people are working by themselves to try and solve this case, and they all kind of need each other or inform each other in a way, not like physically talk to each other, inform each other, but certain things that happen affect the other people involved. Some people do share information, or some people do stumble upon information that someone else has left, but they all stay pretty isolated the whole time, which is an interesting idea for a very multiple character book. There were a couple of moments even where you see from one perspective a person that you know. Michael will see Louis, but he doesn't know that's who that is, and you as the reader do know that's who that is. And then in the next chapter you see the same event from Louis's perspective. I definitely thought this book was overly long. This isn't a traditional mystery in the way that you could have known the clues and figured out the mystery. The information was just really gathered by the people, and you found it out as they found it out. You might have known something from a previous chapter that other people didn't know, but you were never going to like guess the event. This book was always just going to tell you the solution as the characters found out about it themselves. This book is a series, so there are 3 more books in the series, and they all deal with other cities in the US. I think it's called the Music City series or something like that. So it all does revolve around different cities that have tie-ins to music, and it is discussed, especially because the Axeman himself loves jazz and wants people to play jazz. So I assume that it will be in other books as well. The next book takes place in Chicago, and then New York, and then LA. I guess I would try the other books. I think they're all quite long, and this definitely was overly long. It could have been edited down much more, and there was a lot of kind of like superfluous information. It definitely isn't a fast-paced book, but it didn't feel overly slow, and it did read quite quickly. As far as Savidge Prompts, and this being set in a city that I love, one of my favorite cities, it is obviously set in New Orleans, and because it's historical fiction, there are certain things that don't exist today, like especially the intense racial segregation and the immigrant segregation in this that are different from the New Orleans that I know. There are some things that are similar to the New Orleans that I know, but overall it didn't feel super New Orleans to me. I could picture New Orleans, and when they talked about a certain place, I knew where that was, but it didn't have the like New Orleans feel, even though there were jazz funerals, even though there were steamboats. It didn't feel super New Orleans to me, and I think what I'm looking for in this video is to feel super New Orleans. One thing that I mentioned before that I really didn't like was because there's so much racial segregation and immigrant segregation, and because that does play a role in the Axeman mystery, as well as the connections of different people in this book, there is a lot of racial slurs, and they are used by characters, not by the author, but they're used so casually that it was quite jarring. There is a little bit of violence in this book, definitely. There is some gruesome moments, but there also are some like fade to black violent scenes. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. I would like to know if you've read The Axeman, what you thought of it. Let me know in the comments below, and when I pick my next book for this vlog, I will come back and tell you about it. It's the middle of April, and I have started my next New Orleans book. I started The House Uptown by Melissa Ginsberg. I don't usually like a child narrator, but luckily this book is told from multiple different perspectives. There aren't like perspective chapters, which I don't like. It's just a book that kind of flows through looking at all the different people involved in the book. So The House Uptown is about Lane, who is the mother of Louise, who is is the mother of Ava. Lane and Louise's relationship was very strained. Lane lived and still lives in her family home in New Orleans, and she was surprised when, after their 17 years of strained mother-daughter relationship, Louise moves out and moves to Iowa and never returns. Lane kind of always suspected that she would come back, and Lane doesn't really understand why anyone would leave New Orleans to begin with. When we first meet Lane and Louise, it's 1997, and Lane is waiting for her lover to come over, who is a married man, and she is hoping that Louise doesn't wake up because this affair is still secret. When we first meet Ava, Ava is reeling from the death of her mother. She's just finished school, and her mother died 3 weeks prior to her finishing school. She's been living with her mother's roommate and friend because they had all lived together previous to Ava's mother, Louise, dying. Louise's death was super sudden, and Ava definitely hasn't had an opportunity to deal with this yet. She's only 14. As soon as school ends, the roommate packs her up, and Ava travels south to New Orleans to live with Lane. When Ava arrives, Lane doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know why this girl is there. She doesn't remember that Louise is dead. She has to go back through her notes and figure out what is happening. And we come to understand that Lane is struggling with her memory. She's struggling with the world around her and the comprehension of the world around her. Luckily, she's had Oliver, her assistant, for many years, and Oliver helps Lane navigate the world and kind of hides away the fact that she is obviously suffering from some sort of dementia. So Lane and Ava's relationship isn't off to a great start right away, and this book so far follows that. I have been reading for a little while. I'm on page 100. This book is 241 pages, a third of the way through. Right now, we're just settling in. We're coming to understand who Lane is. We're coming to understand who Ava is, and they are settling into this new relationship over the summer of how living together is going to look like. Ava wants to know what's going to happen. Is she going to go to school? Is she going to live with Lane going forward? But Lane is in no position to make those decisions or even to really take care of a 14-year-old girl. That's the book so far. I'm liking it. It's really quick, easy to read. It's not super compelling. When I'm not reading it, I'm not jonesing to pick it up. I'm not super excited, like dying to pick it up and read some more of it. But when I am reading it, I'm enjoying it. Lane is an artist, and we hear a lot of talk about her artwork and her process, which is cool. And Ava is exploring the city, so we are seeing aspects of New Orleans. There is a little bit of overlying creeping dread throughout the whole story because obviously Lane is in no state to take care of anyone, not even herself, let alone Ava. And Ava is definitely left to her own devices. So knowing New Orleans, it's a very dangerous city, and you really worry for her safety of her just roaming around on her own. Even though it's talking about New Orleans, I haven't got a super New Orleans feel yet. It doesn't feel super like New Orleans does to me. It doesn't exude that New Orleans feeling. But I do love the feeling that it is exuding. Lane's family home, where she has lived her entire life and where Ava is now exploring, is this kind of magical place. It has all these different rooms and history. Ava will find a room full of Mardi Gras costumes or something to do with how Lane used to throw big art parties back in the day. Or Lane will start talking about a family member who's long been dead as if they're alive. So there is this kind of magical, cluttered, could find anything in this house kind of feeling, which I'm really enjoying. If something exciting happens before the end, I will update you before, but if not, I'll probably just update you at the end of this book. Hello, so I finished The House Uptown by Melissa Ginsberg. If I were a stronger person, I would have DNF'd this in like the last 100 to 50 pages. It was so obvious what was going to happen, and the bad decisions that the adults in this book were making were so ridiculous and so unrealistic that it really made me want to stop reading it. And I think if I were a stronger person, I would have stopped reading it. But when I'm 50 pages from the end, I'm like, I should just keep reading it and find out what happens. But of course, what I thought was going to happen did happen, and it was quite disappointing overall. I'm disappointed in this book for its depiction of New Orleans. It didn't give me those New Orleans feels that I really wanted. I don't love child narrators, so having Ava as one of our main characters wasn't really doing for me. But her bad decisions were explicable, whereas all the adults' bad decisions were completely inexplicable to me. And maybe if you've never read a book before, this would be a good book to start with, because maybe then you wouldn't see the obvious things coming and the obvious themes that were explored in the very ending of this book. I do think there was an exploration of trauma in this book, trauma on like every single character's part, and then the cyclical nature of trauma. But again, it was done in such like obvious, painfully obvious way that the kind of extrapolation that you take is that if this one character's trauma was developed this way and kept secret, then this other character's trauma who is developed in the same way and is told to keep secret is going to be the same. So, you know, that cyclical nature of secrecy and lies and trauma just was not explored in an interesting or innovative way, and nothing in this book was. I am definitely glad to have read it. It's very short. It definitely put me in a little bit of a reading slump, so I'm not thrilled about that. Another book crossed off, and not the worst. I don't know if I would read anything else by Melissa Ginsberg. I think if this were the bar, it didn't really excite or interest me enough. I like that she was writing about an artist and a painter, and I like that some of those ideas of the obsessive artist were explored. I like books about artists. It wasn't done in a way that was particularly enticing, interesting, or new. You know, is there any really reason to read another one of her books? I don't know. I don't actually know what other books she's written, but I'm not super keen to find out either. So that was the second book that I read about New Orleans. Start Jazz Funeral by Julie Smith. Although it's quite long, almost 400 pages, like 370 pages, I know that I can read these really quickly. They're super fun, and I do love me a cozy mystery.
Honey, you've got a big storm coming.
As always, with a Skip Langdon mystery, I think there are some deeper, more interesting topics than just a cozy mystery. So I'm excited to read more. I'm only at page 88, so I haven't read that much. We have Establish Who's Died. It is the third in the series. I thought it was the fourth. So I have read 1, 2, and 4, and this is number 3. And Skip, who is a police detective, is now like comfortable in her job. She knows she's a strong detective. She knows her allies on the force. She knows her enemies on the force. One of her best friends, who's also her landlord, helps her like pick out clothes and stuff just because she's not that interested in it. And so he makes an appearance in this book early on to help her go to a party. She's with her boyfriend, who is a long-distance boyfriend. He lives in California. She lives in New Orleans, and they're hanging out together, and the boyfriend has a temporary job in New Orleans for a few months, so they're actually living together, which is interesting for this book because in past books they've kind of been sure of their relationship but not sure if the long-distance thing will work. So it's interesting to see them living together in this book for a little while. But her boyfriend Steve is super excited to go to this party because it's almost Jazz Fest, and this is a kind of charity event for a Jazz Fest adjacent project that this super famous jazz producer is working on, and Steve's really excited to find all these jazz musicians and hopefully meet some famous people. Steve definitely gets a little starstruck. Whereas Skip is so used to being in the public eye and she's so used to being in the upper echelon classes of New Orleans that this is kind of like fine for her. Like, she's not unhappy to be there, but it's not anything that she like thinks is so amazing. Of course, when they get there, a murder occurs. This big time producer who is putting on this party and who has this side project that some people are very opposed to is found murdered in his house, and Skip immediately takes charge. She clears the scene, she calls other police officers to help her, and she talks to some of the initial witnesses. It turns out that this producer's young sister has disappeared seemingly at the very same time that he was murdered. So Skip thinks that finding this young girl, Melody, is the key to her brother's murder, whether it's because she committed the murder or whether because she saw something, or is it possibly that she's been kidnapped or abducted by the murderer. I haven't read the other books in a while, and I do remember in the other books that we did get perspectives of various people within the case as well as Skip's perspective, and we're getting Melody's perspective. So her being a 16-year-old girl who has witnessed a very traumatic event, we're not 100% sure if that is just her brother being dead or if maybe she did witness the murder, is an interesting thing to think about. She's 16, she's comes from a super rich family, she's been extremely sheltered, but now she's on her own in New Orleans. She's trying to make her way as a singer, and she is aligning herself with people who are musicians so that she can busk on the street. It's interesting to hear from a homeless teen's perspective, and one that doesn't have a lot of experience with the world. So right now it's going okay, but like part of this book, it might be that something really bad happens to her, as often happened to many runaway teens, to many runaways in general, I'm sure. Skip does judge people. She definitely has a chip on her shoulder, especially for rich, upper crust, upper class people, but she also tries to take people like as they come to her, and she tries not to assume too many things before she actually speaks to people. Like, she might have a preconceived notion in her mind, but like you'll get her inner monologue of and her inner thoughts of like what she thinks of the person, and then she will say like, but let me give him a chance or something like that. And I think this book is interesting because she's talking to a lot of teenagers and she's accepting their knowledge and advice and ideas in a way that I think would be uncharacteristic for many police officers and many adults in general. Like, one thing I really don't like is when adults discount children or young adults or teenagers like right off the bat. Obviously they observe things and see things and know things and hear things that like the police would never get a chance to see, and I think Skip is open and accepting to listen to those things, which is interesting. I'm happy to be reading another New Orleans book. I feel like the depiction of New Orleans in this, I already know from the other Skip Langdon books, is solid in my opinion. I haven't seen too much of it in this book yet, but again, I'm only under 100 pages in, so. It is May 12th, and I have not finished Jazz Funeral yet. I'm about 150 pages from the end, and this book is just really dragging for me, way more than any of the other Skip Langdon books that I've read. I think that's because in all the other Skip Langdon books that I've read, there are points of view besides Skip's. So we mostly see Skip in all those other books, but we do hear from the suspects. We do learn about things that Skip doesn't know about. That for me is a weird kind of middle ground. I don't love dual perspective where it's just two people's perspective. I don't love multiple perspective where each chapter is a different person. I don't love, especially a mystery where you are finding things out that the sleuth or the police detective is not finding out. But I think in the other Skip Langdon books it works partly because of the different topics that she talks about in her books. Although I would definitely consider these cozy mysteries, she does talk about heavier topics a lot of times. She talks about eating disorders, she talks about colorism, she talks about racial divides, she talks about domestic violence. So I think getting the perspective of other characters, other players in the book helps her talk about those things and helps those topics come up without being overly like preachy or without taking away from the main story. But in Jazz Funeral, we're following Skip. We're also seeing the murder victim's sister who has gone missing, but we know as the audience that she has run away. I don't think that's a spoiler because you find out her perspective pretty soon after learning that she's missing. Like, I understand, again, they are dealing with other topics, heavier topics than just a cozy mystery would. They're dealing with runaway teens, they're dealing with selling your body for sex, or they're dealing with young people getting into situations that they can't handle. But the chapters that we follow the young sister are so long and boring, and I think that the focus is more on those chapters and the chapters of her parents looking for her than they are on Skip's investigation. Like, I feel like only a small fraction of this book we've been seeing Skip. Being the main character, I want to see Skip. I want to know what she's doing. I want to see what she and her boyfriend are doing during this investigation. I want to see her, gay best friend. Like, I want to see these people. So not focusing on them is really like taking me out of the story, and it's been like a real slog to get through. When I finish this, I will come back and update you. So I have finally, oops, that's the wrong book. So I have finally finished Jazz Funeral by Julie Smith, and I really didn't like this one. This is definitely by far the least favorite of mine in the series. I read the fourth book first, then the first, second, and third books in this series. This one was just, it never got any better. I talked about it. It was so much involved with the extra characters, the characters specific to this case and this book, and just not enough about Skip, not enough about Steve, not enough of a mystery even. Yeah, so I didn't love this one. I do think that this one has the best depictions of New Orleans. It still has the most New Orleans feel to me. They go to a ton of places in this book, all of which, even if I haven't been to that specific location, I can picture really well. She obviously knows the city really well, and she just does a great job of drawing you into the city. Next in the most New Orleans-esque was actually Axeman. The more I think back on this one, I think that the flooding and the storm and the kind of visceral nature of that, especially knowing the history, more recent history of New Orleans, was more New Orleans feeling than I originally thought or that I originally felt. Looking back on it, I feel like this one was the next most New Orleans book. And then the least New Orleans book, I think, was Melissa Ginsberg's The House of Town. Now, I did like the depictions of artwork in this and the kind of bohemian, hippie-ish nature of Lane. So there were things that felt wild and free that reminded me of New Orleans in this book. A lot of these books felt like they could take place in any city, but this one kind of just didn't have that heart of New Orleans feeling that I wanted. Although none of these were terrible. I mean, none of them were not New Orleans-y at all, they just weren't New Orleans-y enough. Unfortunately, this vlog didn't turn out the best. This was my April and May picks for the Savidge Reads. So it was a book set in your favorite city, which all three of these fall into for April, and then May's prompt is a secondhand or borrowed book, and these all fall into that as well because I only buy secondhand books, so I knew that that would be an easy one for me. So I'm counting it for both months. I did finish the first two books in April and the last book in May, and unfortunately I didn't really love any of them. Now looking back, I think probably Axeman was my favorite, and I have thought about it a little more. I think, interested in picking up the next in the series and see how that one goes. And I will be always reading more Julie Smith books. I knew she had another series set in New Orleans, but I didn't realize that she has another female lead cozy mystery
collection, so I would be interested in trying that. I definitely want to try her other New Orleans mysteries, which are focused on a lawyer in New Orleans. I definitely want to read more of the Skip Langdon books, especially because I think that the fourth one probably has been my favorite, which was the first one I read, so it could be that. Those were the books that I read for Savidge Prompts. Let me know what you read for April and May's prompts. Let me know what your favorite city that you chose to read books set in was. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!